I think there are certain stories in American history that are going to be revisited and revisited and revisited. Subsequent generations need to sort of sift through it and make sense of it and capitalize on new documents that might emerge. The Lincoln assassination is certainly one. The Kennedy assassination is certainly another. And certainly this is one of those stories. The spring of 1968 was the closest our country has come to a national nervous breakdown, since the Civil War, I think. And there's so many forces colliding and sort of converging really in literal and figurative terms on Memphis. And I think so. This is a book that is about an assassination, but is really about the times more than anything else. The zeitgeist. It's about the constellation of forces that were swirling around this event. People who've read the book have described it as a thriller at times, in the sense that it is a detective story. It is very much a story that becomes a sort of about a manhunt, but it's also a requiem, I think, about the end of the civil rights movement, about the last days of a great man, it's kind of a bittersweet story in the end. They do catch the killer, but there's no getting around the fact that this was one of our great national tragedies, and so it's a story that has a lot of different emotional textures to it. I wanted to do this book at first largely because I wanted to go back to my hometown, which was Memphis. I grew up there, was born there, and this was probably the most pivotal, the most devastating moment in Memphis's history, and the shockwaves from this event still kind of emanate from the Lorraine Motel there, where King was killed, and the city's still, in many ways, kind of struggling, grappling with it, trying to figure out what it means. So I wanted to go back to this period. My father was an attorney in Memphis, and he worked for the law firm that represented King when he came there to represent the garbage workers. And so I heard a lot through my dad about what was going on downtown and how the strike was building towards some kind of violent ending. And then, of course, it did. King came and was shot, and there were riots in streets, and many people in Memphis feared there was going to be a race riot. It was a very, very agitated and very inflamed and very difficult time for the city, and I wanted to go back and revisit that. The portrait that I paint of King, I think, is a very different portrait from the King that most people have come to know now that he's a national holiday and he's been sainted, essentially. He's in our pantheon of saints. But people forget that in his last years, King was very controversial. He was very he was staking increasingly what would be considered radical positions. He had moved from just mere civil rights work to being a vocal critic of the Vietnam War, and also beginning to look at poverty. Just the roots of poverty, the causes of poverty, the solutions for poverty, and was beginning to advocate some pretty radical positions about redistribution of wealth, and that's essentially what the Poor People's Campaign was all about. So he was grappling with some huge issues, and of course, by taking the positions that he took, especially on Vietnam, he made a lot of very powerful enemies in Washington. LBJ, who had made history with King just a few years earlier, really wouldn't even receive him in the White House, wouldn't talk to him anymore. He was also under a lot of stress. He was getting death threats weekly, if not daily. He was drinking more, smoking more. His marriage with Coretta was crumbling. He was a very different King than the one that we now recognize when we celebrate, the "I Have a Dream" speech and that sort of thing. So I think the book really looks at those last few weeks of his life when these stresses become magnified to. I mean, he's really on the verge of some sort of breakdown, and how he kind of comes out of that with that last speech of his life the night before he's killed.